There isn't one kind of communication that works. There is wanting to communicate that works.
That's gold.
When we assign someone a label without knowing them, we assume that they maximize that label. I spend 2% of my time thinking about politics. Why are we letting this 2% dominate how we see each other when there's 98% where we have a lot in common?
Communication is a superpower. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and best-selling author Charles Duhigg knows that as well as anyone. He's influenced millions of readers through his work over the years and has proven that good storytelling is the key to transforming the way we collaborate, influence, and ultimately connect.
What's the toughest conversation you've had in the last year?
It rocked my world. I learned from different sources that I think the best way to become interesting is to be interested.
So the hack is,
You're kidding.
right.
As I was doing research on your story, fascinating that as you decide to move from one sector to journalism, and then pretty early on, you are in Iraq.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm really fascinated within the context of communication. And you talk a lot of interviews about habits and things you learned in Iraq about habits through the military.
Yeah.
But I'm also curious, in that part of the world, in a war-type situation, very tense, what was that like for you as you were watching communication happen as well?
Nobody's ever asked this before, but a lot of what I learned about communication comes from my time in Iraq. Both because there's something that's unusual about warfighters today, which is you could be in the battlefield and you can call your wife or your husband every single night, right? You can just get online. And of course, you have just lived through the most intense day of your life, and you call them up, and they just took the kids to school, right? Now they're making dinner. And so there's this real challenge of service people in the field. We need to teach them the right communication habits, because otherwise you're going to see divorce, you're going to see people distracted with their own control, you're going to see people who are unhappy, they're worried about what's going on at home. And so there's this real focus on how do we figure out how to do communication. Not just communication with home, but also communication with your fellow soldiers, right? Communication with headquarters. Communication is the first thing that you set up when you're in battle. You must have a communication system for your troops to be safe. And so thinking about the science of communication is really, really important.
Yeah, okay, so that's fascinating because I'm thinking of a service member who may have had a near-death experience, or certainly a day that is just next-level stress. Calls home. His wife begins to tell him about her day,
right,
and how awful it was, and it was.
Yeah, kids
maybe
were crying.
Something happened. Got a call from the school. Jimmy hit another kid. I had to go in. I don't know what's going on. And she is attempting to connect and to kind of share these with him. And he can't even process that, I'm guessing, because of it pales in comparison to where he's at, or his nervous system is just in a whole different world. Is that the dynamic?
Well, so what's interesting, so this gets to what we know about the science of communication. So this book actually, Super Communicators, actually started because I fell into this pattern with my wife, which isn't that dissimilar from what you're describing. A lot less intense.
Right.
But and I think this is probably something that all of us can identify with. I would come home from work and I'd start complaining about my day, and I'd say like, oh, my boss doesn't appreciate me, and my coworkers don't realize what a genius I am. And my wife would give me this good advice. She'd say something like, oh, why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other. And instead of being able to hear her advice, I would basically get more upset. And I would say like, no, you're supposed to be supporting me. You're supposed to be on my side. And I think when you're in a battlefield, the same thing happens, right? You're coming to someone and you're bringing them an experience that you've had. And unless they show you that they hear the kind of conversation you want to have, it's very hard for you. And so I went to all these neuroscientists and I asked them like, why do I keep getting into this problem with my wife? Why does this happen when we're calling, from different experiences, but we love each other? They said, well, we're actually living through this golden age of understanding communication for really the first time. And what we've learned is that when you have a discussion, you think you know what that discussion is about, right? You and I are talking about our day, or we're talking about where the kids' grades are at, or where we should go on vacation, or next year's budget. But actually, every discussion has different kinds of conversations in it. And these conversations, they tend to fall into one of three buckets. There's emotional conversations where I'm telling you how I feel. Then there's practical conversations where we're solving problems together. Social conversations about how we relate to each other in society. And they said if you're having different kinds of conversations, you literally can't hear each other. You can't connect. So I was having an emotional conversation with my wife. She was responding with a practical conversation. We were like ships passing in the night. And I think the same thing happens when you call from a war zone or just from a long trip that you're on or a busy day, is that you might be signaling, I need to have an emotional conversation. I need to tell you what's going on inside my heart. But the person you're talking to is in a practical mindset. They're saying, sounds to me like you're mentioning a problem I just solved. And when you have that disconnect, when you don't know how to figure out what conversation is going into each other, that's when all of a sudden you get
Let's dive into the three a little bit more. So I'm sitting here laughing, as you're saying this, because I think I could say this, but correct me if I'm wrong, if your research says something separately. But dudes tend to lean practical. If I look at the three, practical, emotional, and social, I think my default, let me say this, I tend to be the classic guy, the problem solver, but I'm also a guy who likes to see peace. And so just thinking in my personal life, if Stacey comes to me or one of the kids come to me something that's a little bit, it's a problem, and I get practical.
Yeah.
Is that true that men are just default practical?
Well, so what's interesting is it has to do with how we're habituated. So it's not that there's this men are from Mars, women are from Venus. That's not actually true. Basically, our brains work exactly the same way. However, we fall back on the habits that we're most comfortable with. And if you're raised as a man in this country, probably you're getting a lot of practice in the practical mindset, right? Your dad's coming to you, and you guys got to go fix something with a car together. You're at school. You're the quarterback. You're making decisions. And if you're raised as a woman, you just get a lot more practice having emotional conversations. And so it's not necessarily that we're programmed differently. It's that we have these habits we fall back onto. And oftentimes for men, it's more comfortable to be practical. And for women, they're more comfortable with emotional conversations. But what's interesting is, I'll bet you if I was looking at some of your conversations, it was definitely true of mine. And I saw sometimes that it sounded very practical, that actually what I would hear is you're having an emotional conversation, but you're using the language of practicality because that's what you're comfortable with. And finances is a great example, right? We sit down with our spouse to talk about our budget for the next week, for the next month. And we sit down and we say, okay, I've got the budget. Here's all the numbers. Let's go through. And it feels like what we're saying is a practical conversation. But what we're really saying is, I am really freaked out because we overspent last month. And I'm worried if we don't make tuition and mortgage this year, that something bad's going to happen. And so I need to have an emotional conversation with you about, like, I'm anxious. I need you to be anxious too. Wow. So understanding what's actually happening in the conversation as opposed to just the words being used, that's at the core of how it's connected.
Wow. And it feels like we've almost got to get to a place of discipline, maybe a habit to go, before we launch into a conversation, check ourselves.
Absolutely.
Where are we? Are we in a mindset of emotional? Is it practical? Is it social? Is that right?
And there's a hack for this. There's a way to...
People love hacks. This is good.
So when you're starting a conversation, oftentimes, typically if it's important topic, right? I got to sit down with my wife. I got to talk about her spending. I'm thinking all about the things I want to say. I've got in my head my message that I want to get across. But as you know, a conversation is not me just lecturing. It's you. A conversation is a back and forth. So how do we figure out what kind of conversation both of us need to have? The best way is to start by just asking a question. And to ask what's known as a deep question. So a deep question is something that asks about your values or your beliefs or your experiences. And that can sound a little intimidating, but it can actually be as simple as, like, if you meet someone who's a doctor, instead of saying, oh, what hospital do you work at? Asking them, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? Right, that second question, it invites them to tell you who they really are. And so if you're sitting down with a conversation, let's say about your budget with Stacey, and you start by saying, look, I want to talk about the budget. I got a spreadsheet here. Before I do, tell me just how does our financial situation make you feel? How do you make sense of what's going on financially in our life? What you're going to hear is going to tell you whether she's in an emotional mindset or a practical mindset or a social mindset. And by the way, if you ask yourself that question, if you answer your same question and you say, here's why I want to talk about this tonight. This is why it's weighing on my soul. You're going to be telling her what kind of conversation you want to have. So the hack is ask a question. There's actually this great phrase I like. When you're feeling furious, get curious. To help us remember that when we feel like we got something to say, if you start just by asking that question, it's going to make it much more likely that everyone hears us and we hear them down the road.
Wow. And if I'm learning from this real time here, by doing that, you get the best chance of getting on the same level.
That's exactly right.
It's really about connection here. Are we both? If she's practical and I'm emotional, we've got a real problem.
You've got a real problem. And there's actually an interesting science behind this. So because of how our brains have developed, when we are having a good conversation, our bodies and our brains start to match each other. So without us realizing it, in this conversation, our heart rate is starting to change. Our breath patterns are starting to change. Even the dilation of our pupils is starting to change. And more importantly, what's happening is that our brains are starting to look more and more similar. And that kind of makes sense when you think about it, because if I tell you about a feeling that I'm having, you actually experience that feeling. But that similarity, that simultaneity, is known as neural entrainment. Neural entrainment is the goal of communication. And when it happens, again, because of how our brains have developed, because we're pro-social creatures, when we achieve neural entrainment, we feel great, right? That's why you feel so good to have a good conversation, is because you've actually entrained with the other person. So you're exactly right. We think of the goal of communication as communicating information. The goal of communication is actually to connect with the other person. And even if you and I disagree about politics or religion or finances, even if we walk away from the conversation still disagreeing with each other, as long as we have felt connected, we trust each other more, we like each other more, we feel better about each other. And that conversation has been a complete success.
Wow. Okay, so much to cover.
Yeah.
Let's get...
And I might ask you some questions too, if that's okay.
Go for it. I'm sitting here thinking about one of the biggest tensions for professionals is communication between them and their leader. That's a biggie.
Yeah.
But them and their coworker as well.
Right.
So I want to dive into those because in the context here of those three types of conversations. So we got the practical, the emotional, and the social. High level, would you suggest, and I'm feeling like I would suggest, that we learn how to do all three of these well with the leader and with the coworker, for purposes of this big word that really is underneath all this is connection.
Yeah.
You agree with that? We need to be intentional?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And every discussion we have usually has all three conversations in it, right? We move from the emotional to the social to the practical back to the emotional. As long as we're moving together, we feel connected. But let me ask you, because you have bosses, you have coworkers. How is your communication with your bosses? How have you found that you feel a sense of connection? Because they clearly like you, they hired you, they brought you in, they start sort of helping you become the best version of yourself. But then you sit down with like your boss, right? And you're having lunch together. And the fact that they're your boss and that you're the worker, that's not something that disappears.
That's right.
How have you found that your relationship is maturing?
I think that the more you can connect socially with your leader, then I feel like you have a greater chance at connection. Because if you start talking, like if all you ever do with your leader is come to them with your emotional stuff, right? Like, hey, we're frustrated here, this isn't happening here, then I'm constantly coming to them with that emotional, okay, here's a problem, help me solve it, which is their role, is for them to step in and help you do your thing best. But I have found that the leaders that I connected with the most, so try to answer that from a mature, good, healthy relationship, it's the ones that we have, it doesn't mean we're hanging out all the time, but that we spend a good amount of time when we are communicating in a social, so we could be talking about sports for me, we could be talking about politics. I find those conversations fascinating. I think that's what comes to mind to me, is that it's really important on the social thing first. In fact, I think that's what I would tell a young person coming into the workplace. Find a way to connect on a social level, a social conversation, find common ground.
That's exactly, I love that answer because you're exactly right. Oftentimes when we go to our boss, we are bringing them an emotional conversation, it's a problem you need to solve, or bringing them a practical conversation, like here's another problem you need to solve.
Yeah, right.
The thing about a social conversation is it's just fun. There's no problem, right?
Right.
And so what is a social conversation? So we've got the practical, the emotional, and the social. The social, actually about 70% of our conversations are social in nature. And we tend not to totally realize it because anytime we talk about another person, we're having a social conversation. When I say like, oh, what's it like being with Dave? That's a social conversation. You and I are basically peers and what an experience that experience is like. Anytime we talk about, what's it like to live here in Franklin? Like, what do you like about it? What do you enjoy? That's a social conversation because I'm asking you, what do you like about the community? What is it that really gets you going in the morning? Most of the conversations we have are social, and the thing that's nice about a social conversation is we are equal experts in our own experience.
That's right.
So I know what it's like to live in California, and you know what it's like to live in Tennessee. And if you tell me Tennessee's the greatest place on the face of the planet, I might say I like California too, but you're an expert in Tennessee. I don't have any right to tell you that you're wrong.
Right.
And that's what's nice about these social conversations, particularly with our bosses, is that it's a great leveler. We get to talk to each other as humans instead of as boss and employees.
Yes. You know what I found over the years, because I wrote a book called The Proximity Principle. It became a bestseller, and the whole concept was the right people plus the right places equals opportunity. But when you start talking about connecting, here's what I found. I'm curious to know what you think of this. I think the best way to become interesting is to be interested.
Yes.
In other words, if you and I just met, and I know a little bit about you, but I begin to ask you questions, and I'm diving in. Charles, how did you get into journalism? You tell me. And I go, where'd you start? And you tell me. And you go, really? And so as you've moved on, like, where do you see and I move in from like your experience to a little bit of opinion, and all of a sudden, without you realizing it, you now feel a bit of a social burden, I would say, to go, Ken's really interested in me. We've talked about me for a good 10 minutes. I probably should return serve. As opposed to trying to go and just be winsome and be super charming. As I've told young people that if you want to be interesting and make people remember you, that would lead to an opportunity down the line. And if you get a moment with somebody, you better be interested in them. They have a better chance of remembering you. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, 100%. And I will say that there's a little finesse to this, right? Which is, I want to be interested in you, but we don't want it to feel like an interview. We don't want it to feel like, we don't want to feel like, I've got 30 questions to ask you that we just sat down next to each other on a bus.
Yeah.
So one of the nice things about these deep questions is that when I ask you a deep question, when I ask you, instead of the facts of your life, how you feel about your life, it's very natural for me to answer my own question and contribute to the conversation. So if you say, I'm a doctor, and I say, oh, why'd you decide to become a doctor? And you say, oh, I saw my dad get sick as a kid. It's very, very natural for me to say, oh, that's so interesting. I'm a lawyer, and I saw my uncle get arrested when I was a kid, and I wanted to be someone who fought for people like my uncle. Now, suddenly, we're talking about our experiences, right? I'm interested in you, but I'm also sharing about myself. And one of the things that we know, this is actually the strongest social impulse in humans, is this thing known as social reciprocity, exactly what you just said. That when you ask a question and you share something about yourself, you want me to share something about myself. When you show a little bit of vulnerability, if I show vulnerability in return, if I reciprocate, we trust each other. So you're exactly right that asking questions, being interested in other people, is the best way to make a connection with them. And then on top of that, to say, in addition to asking you and learning about you, I want to share who I am. And so even if you haven't gotten a chance to ask a question, maybe you're someone who's not practiced at asking questions, I'm going to answer my own question because it's going to give us a way to bridge to each other.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. We live in a society that recognizes go-getters and entrepreneurs, and it's absolutely right to value that independence. The ability to have a dream, work hard, and make it reality is important. But it's easy to forget that no one can do it alone. We're all better with a support system, including me. I rely heavily on some guys in my life to keep me accountable and encourage me when I need it. And therapy can also be a great source of support for any area of your work life or personal life. So if you're thinking about starting therapy, try BetterHelp. BetterHelp is 100% online therapy with licensed therapists. That means you can talk with your therapist when it's convenient for your schedule. Just fill out a short online survey to get matched with a therapist, and if that one isn't a fit, you can switch providers at any time for no extra cost. Asking for help isn't weakness. So this month, strengthen your support system with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/Ken to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp.com/Ken. All right, let's go to a question.
So just going back to the hack for a minute, when you're sitting down with your wife or a coworker and you quickly realize, hey, this is a practical discussion for me, but they're highly emotional. Is it, in my mind, there's a few choices here. Either you jump down to the highly emotional state they're in, which might not be the right answer for the conversation. You drag them kicking and screaming up to your practicality. Or do you kind of default back to the social? And if that's the answer, that might not be conducive to the conversation or even make sense. So, is it you bring someone kicking and screaming up, you dive down, do you try to find neutral ground and start over, or what is that?
It's a great question. It's a fantastic question. And the thing to realize about matching each other, and this is actually known in psychology as the matching principle. We have to have the same kind of conversation at the same moment. If someone's really emotional, matching them does not mean that I have to become emotional myself. But it does mean that I need to acknowledge that they're feeling something, right? So sometimes it's as simple as saying, it seems like this is really upsetting you, and I want to talk about solutions. I want to talk about some practical solutions. But before we do, just tell me why this is bugging you, because it seems like this is a big deal. When I do that, I'm inviting them to tell me about their emotions. We're having an emotional conversation. Now, I don't have to say like, oh, look, I feel the same way, or I don't have to say, here's the turmoil I've experienced in my life. It's just acknowledging that they are feeling something that has that conversation. Now, I'll give you another example where it's a little bit easier, is that you're sitting down in a conference room, you're waiting for a meeting to start, you turn to the guy next to you and you say, oh, how was your weekend? And they say, oh man, it was great. I went to my kid's graduation. It was a great weekend. Now, the easiest thing to do is to say, oh, congratulations. That's so good to hear. Here's the agenda. Let's go ahead and start going through the agenda. But if you just take a second and you think, oh, this guy just told me how he was feeling. And you turn to him and you say, oh, what did that feel like to watch your kid walk across that stage? Like, now you are matching him on the emotional conversation. And he's going to tell you for 30 or 45 seconds. And then you can say, oh, that sounds amazing. Thank you for sharing that with me. We should probably get down to this agenda. And now you guys are in sync. Now you're moving together. So for that conversation with that employee who's really worked up, simply saying, tell me what you're feeling. I want to acknowledge, here's what I'm hearing you say. Can we start talking about solutions now? Because I think I know that can we move from an emotional to a practical conversation? Do I have your permission? What you're going to find is that you guys are moving together.
Makes sense.
And honestly, this matching, this taking the time to figure out what's going on, it usually only takes about 30 seconds. Right? It's really fast, and it makes that next 3 or 4 minute conversation so much more impactful. Because if you do have them stacked, and everyone walks away from that meeting saying, he didn't listen to me, I don't understand what he said, you really just wasted all that time.
But it's surprising how much is missed.
Yeah.
Two observations, because this is a great leadership question.
Yeah.
This is probably one of the most difficult things about leading people, is you gotta be a people person, people officer, right? So I think there's two things that are interesting around this question. One, we've got to remember as leaders, and the data shows us this, that people are still little boys and little girls. And they are looking at their leader in some way as a parent.
Yeah.
Do you see me? Do you hear me? You know what I mean? And they're bringing that to us. And many times, I love the way you answer that, because I think that is a simple way to meet that primal need. Do you see me? Do you value me? Am I a unit of production, or do you see me as a person? I think that's one. The second observation is, and I love the way he set that up, as a leader, you're sitting there, and you can see their emotions. Okay? He or she, as a leader, may also have something going on in their personal life, or some emotion going on in them in the workplace too. So they've got emotional junk and turmoil and trash
Yeah.
You know, my therapist calls it, we're all walking around with our own garbage. And so you got that going on, and that affects your ability sometimes. These leaders, I can see how it would be very impairing. I don't know if I've got the emotional bandwidth to meet them there. What are your thoughts on that?
So it's a really good question. When someone comes to us and they're bringing up some emotions, they want to have an emotional conversation. What they're looking for is they're looking for us to acknowledge their emotions. And sometimes the way we do that is we say, I know what you're feeling because I felt it myself. Like, I understand you're feeling stressed and overwhelmed. When I was in your role, I felt stressed and overwhelmed, and I still kind of do, right? I understand what you're going through. I hear what you're saying. But on the other hand, there's these times when someone comes up and they say, I'm really stressed about the budgets, and you say, or their boss says, oh, I totally understand. I have a dog who's sick right now. It's totally stressing me out, right? In a situation like that, I'm not actually acknowledging that I feel what you're saying. I'm trying to steal the spotlight from you onto me. So how do I show you that I'm listening? How do I prove that I'm paying attention? Sometimes it's just asking a question. I'm sorry you're stressed out. Tell me more about that. Like, what does it feel like? Sometimes it's sharing something about yourself. If it is something that complements what the person is saying instead of trying to take the spotlight from them. But in general, if your motive is to show this person that you are listening, you're going to do the right thing.
I agree with that. This is probably one of the biggest issues in the workforce right now, and I saw some recent data that 74% of Gen Z struggle to make light conversation with coworkers. And I'm raising 3 Gen Z. I love them. I'm not going to be a boomer here, but I do bring it up because I think for a lot of leaders out there, and it's almost, you can't go a week without seeing a major headline about Gen Z and the tension in the workplaces. They come in and they begin to really start to settle in at work in light of what we're talking about. And you're leading Gen Z. And you feel frustrated, and you're feeling this 74%. And what do you do in that situation? Because they've not been taught how to have a conversation.
And much of the time it's been over text, right? So like
that's what they prefer.
Without an emoji, they don't know how to tell you how they're feeling.
It's funny you say that. The study said that most of them feel more comfortable using some type of chat system,
right,
or social media to communicate to somebody who's sitting next to them.
Yeah.
And we've all seen this as parents where they're all in the back seat.
Absolutely.
They're texting each other.
Right.
And you're sitting next to them.
And you're like, why don't you just pick up the phone and ask Jasper what's going on this evening? And they're like, make a phone call with my phone? That's the weirdest thing I've ever heard.
Right.
It's totally impolite. So how do we deal with that? How do we deal with whether there's generational differences, other kinds of identity differences, right? If I walk into an environment where I'm religious and no one else is religious, or they're all religious and I'm not a person of faith, how do we bridge that? Well, what we're really talking about is we're talking about different norms, right? That there's a set of norms that I've become accustomed to that you might not be inculcated. You might not just know about them. So how do we establish norms? Usually by talking about them. Good leaders can start by saying, look, I want to tell you how I communicate. Right? I prefer face-to-face to email. When I send you a text, I want you just to text back and just let me know that you've read it. And by the way, tell me how you communicate, right? If you're someone who doesn't like face-to-face quite so much, tell me, like, if I have something that I need to give to you, and we need to think it through. How do you want me to approach it? You want me to schedule some time to do that? You want me to send an email and then we can talk about it? When we make norms explicit, we make the communication easier. And we've seen a lot of this around conversation. There was a really interesting experiment that was done by a young professor from Dartmouth, where she brought together friends who were black and white. And she asked them to have conversations about race. These are all college students. And she would tell them at the last minute, this is a conversation about race. One of you is black, one of you is white. Talk about racial experiences. And when she set it up like that, these were good friends. These were people who spent time together. The conversations did not go well, right? She said, try and talk for at least 10 minutes. One pair who were great friends, they talked for 45 seconds and they were like, okay, I gotta go now. Thanks. That was right. Because It's awkward and it feels. And then she told another group, again, same instructions, do this, but before you start the conversation, I want you to do 2 things. Number 1, start by saying, this is gonna possibly be awkward, right? I want to talk about something that it's sometimes hard to talk about, and I want you to know that even though it's awkward, I actually think it's really important because I want to understand this aspect of it. That's number one. Number two is, before you start that conversation, anticipate an obstacle. Anticipate something that's going to make you feel kind of like, ooh, and then figure out what you're going to do next. When people did that, when they acknowledged that this was going to be awkward, they established a norm, it's okay for this to be awkward, and then they thought about their own responses to that norm violation, the conversations went fantastic. Those people would talk for 30 or 40 minutes. They would talk, these were friends who had known each other for years, and they would talk about these experiences that they had never shared with each other. So airing those norms, talking about them, makes that communication better.
I'm having fun with this, but I'm also very serious. This could change Thanksgiving and Christmas conversations over politics in America, because we have gotten so... And I want to ask a quick follow-up on that, because I think this is practical for a lot of people. In light of what you just said, I think that's brilliant. I think it's actually, if you write that down, I want to hit it again for the audience. I mean, that is, okay, I want to tell them ahead of time, this could be awkward. Might be a little tense. And then I'm thinking, what could be a real hurdle that they could throw at me, and how will I attempt to scale it? That's really good.
That's exactly it.
All right. Do you think that existed? Do you think we could have conversations about race or politics or religion 50 years ago, and it's gotten worse? Or are we just now so much more connected via devices and everybody can throw their opinion out? Do you understand the question?
Yeah.
Has it gotten worse, or has it always been that way, and we just are now exposed to the fact that none of us know how to communicate on something that's kind of controversial?
So I think there was a time when it was better in this country. I think
that would be my feeling.
Yeah, and all the research shows us we've become more polarized. A way I like to put it is, we've kind of fallen out of practice of having these hard conversations, right? So 50 years ago, your and my grandfathers, they belonged to the Elks Club or to the Rotary Club, and they probably had a church that they went to on Sundays and then a prayer group on Wednesdays. They had a whole community, and in that community, they were practicing conversation all the time. They were very, very good at it. So that doesn't necessarily mean you and I agree with each other, but this gets to what the goal of the conversation is. The goal of a conversation is not for us to agree. The goal of a conversation is not to convince you you're right or you're wrong and I'm right, or I'm smart or you should like me. The goal of a conversation is just to understand how you see the world and to speak in such a way that you understand how I see the world. And if we walk away from a conversation disagreeing with each other, but we've got that understanding, the conversation has been a success.
It's hard to hate somebody you understand.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when you know that they want to understand you, you want to understand them in return. So I think what happened in the past is that we just had more practice signaling that we wanted to understand. And we've fallen out of practice. We've fallen out of practice with technology. We've fallen out of practice because it's a lot easier to not talk to people who disagree with us now. Or if we do talk to people who disagree with us, to be screaming at each other. But for each of us, as leaders in our families and in our communities and in our businesses, we can take that responsibility on to not only practice doing this, but to model it for other people. Because that's going to give them the confidence to practice.
Charles, I think we need a massive filter. You're a member of the media and have been at the highest levels in the print media, obviously. But I just read something recently that this is the third consecutive year where the majority of U.S. adults have no trust in the media.
Yeah.
That has to play into what we were just talking about. If you look at the 50s maybe, and you move us to where we are today, it is so divisive. How much do we blame legacy media, big media, whether they're right, left, center? Thoughts on that data?
So I think one of the things that's happened, and I'm curious your thoughts on this as someone who's on TV a lot and obviously on podcasts. And it used to be everyone watched the same newscast. And so we kind of all just agreed on what the same topics were. Now, the same important things to talk about. Now, that might not have been as inclusive as it should have been, and we might have been talking about these issues and not that issues, but we all had a common prayer book that we were sort of reading from. Now, everything is so balkanized, right? You and I probably, our media diet probably overlaps by most 15%. And that's actually really, really high.
Wow.
Yeah. And if we were to do this whole room, I'll bet you that there's a podcast that one person in this room listens to and no one else listens to, and we can multiply that by 10. Everything's kind of balkanized now. So as a result, we're getting all these little different pieces of input, pieces of news. And so when I sit down with you and I want to talk about politics, in my head, I've got 5 things that I'm thinking about, that I've heard about, that seem like the most important things on earth. And you've got 5 different things that you've heard about that seem like the most important thing on earth. And you're saying, how to come he doesn't take seriously this thing that's so clearly important? That's where this breakdown happens. But so what cuts through that? What cuts through that is our lived experiences. Because it does not matter what newspaper you read or what podcast you listen to. We both have kids. We know what it's like to raise teenagers. They might watch completely different TikTok channels. They might watch, but they all sometimes act like 13-year-olds.
Well, you're very diplomatic.
In both the best and the worst ways possible. Yeah. So that's something. If we set all that stuff aside and we say, "What's it like? Tell me what it's like to be raising kids. Let me tell you what it's like for me." Suddenly now we are reading from that same prayer book. We have the same experiences we can talk about. And that's how we get from there to saying like, oh, now that I know a little bit about you, like, who'd you vote for last time? Tell me a little bit about that.
That's great. That's really good. Because here's the deal. We see what we want to see. We hear what we want to hear. And there's just so much built-in bias. It's fascinating to me how we all just kind of like forget how much our own fears, our own shared experiences growing up, in the tribe we run with, right?
Yeah.
We all kind of have some commonality there. So these people here are crazy, they're nuts.
Right.
They hate people like me. Then you just start spinning into this narrative that's almost impossible to overcome, except for what you just said. And I think that's huge. Because you could be sitting next to a raging conservative or a liberal at a soccer game, and if you never get into that, you walk away going, what a fantastic guy. I'm telling my wife, this guy, super interesting. But if I found out something about how he did this, or he votes and thinks this, I may not give him the time of day.
That's absolutely right. And I was just talking to a researcher at NYU, Dave Van Bagel, who's done a lot of work on this. And one of the things he's found is that when we assign someone a label without knowing them, we assume that they maximize that label. So if I know that you're a Democrat, I assume you are all for trans rights and gay marriage and X and Y and Z. And if you hear I'm a Republican, you're going to assume that I'm pro-gun and I'm pro-Trump and I pro-military. And the truth of the matter is, in actuality, yeah, you're a Democrat, but you're like 10% a Democrat, right? And I'm 10% a Republican. And so if we live side by side and we put those different signs on our lawn, then the truth of the matter is, the thing that we have in common, like I spend 2% of my time thinking about politics, and 10% of my time thinking about the pothole that's in front of my house.
Right.
And my neighbor's thinking about that pothole too, right?
Yes, there's a shared value.
Exactly. So why are we letting this 2% dominate how we see each other when there's 98% where we have a lot in common?
Yeah.
And that's the key is, even if we know someone is a label, even if we hear this person is an X or Y or Z, or they self-identify that way, or we just look at them and we say, oh, that person is different from me, that does not mean that we've done a good job of estimating who they are. And the only way to estimate who they are is to go up and ask them about their experiences.
Yeah. Before I move on from this topic, I am curious if you could wave a wand and fix big-time media's trust issue. People don't trust them. I mean, you're inside. I am just curious because I think, how would they begin to communicate differently? Because they've got a communication and a connection problem.
Yeah.
They seem to just connect to our fears.
So I think that we used to live in a world, I'll talk mostly about print, because that's my background. We used to live in a world where most people had local newspapers, right? Take the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or Fox News or CNN. They're talking to literally the entire world. And so it's pretty hard to signal to folks, I'm listening to you, unless they're spot on your Democrat. But the Tennessean, the Akron paper, the Santa Cruz Sentinel, they're talking to a much smaller group. They can say, maybe our politics are left or right, but like, here's the things we're thinking about. It's the same things you're thinking about because we live next to each other. I don't know how big media turns this around without getting closer to different groups. And we see that happening right now. Axios it has a bunch of Axios locals who are trying to talk to specific communities and cities. But the closer we get to the local, the more that these kind of big political issues fade away.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think that's why we've seen the rise of podcasting.
Yes, absolutely.
Podcasting has risen in its credibility because you feel like talking about stuff that I actually care about.
I hadn't even thought about that till you just said this, but I actually think podcasts might be the new local newspaper. And it's not necessarily a local newspaper geographically. It could be, I really like Pokemon cards, and there's 60 other people in the world who do, and so we're going to listen to the Pokemon podcast. You're right. We're getting closer to that local story.
How did you respond when you see the Trump White House, has now said, we're going to give press passes to major podcasters?
I think it's
that
great.
Has leveled the playing field.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think the more that we do anything to expand the conversation, to get closer to the people who are having that conversation, the better off we are.
I just, I'm aging myself here, but I just could picture a world where Sam Donaldson is next to Joe Rogan.
I would pay money to.
I would too. That's a press conference the world needs to see. We need to bring Sam out of retirement. Oh, that's great. All right, let's go to a question about that group.
Yeah, I was just going to say, one, thank you for that conversation about just how we can connect over politics. I think it's one of the most important things we can be cultivating right now. For myself, this idea of when I get curious, like I'm definitely taking that away. And I'm like, I think this is really good interpersonally for me. I'm interested to hear what you think about our political leaders in the sense that misunderstanding seems to be a benefit, not a benefit of the system, not a flaw. It's like we have to be misunderstood because then we can cultivate our group of people. And how do you see this playing into like our actual political leaders? Can you help them?
So it's interesting. I have a couple of friends who are serving in Congress. One who's a senator and a couple who are Congress people. And they say that the biggest difference now when they come in, it used to be, again, 50 years ago, even like 20 years ago, you came in and like you'd get on TV and you'd say like, those guys are the worst, they're awful. And then once the camera stopped, you'd go have dinner with those guys. Right?
Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan.
Exactly.
Famous for that.
Exactly. And what's happened now is that has stopped. People have stopped talking across the line. And there's a bunch of reasons why. Part of it is money. Part of it is that primaries have become so much more contentious and you don't want to be tarred and feathered as someone who talks to the other side. But the number one piece of advice that I think I would give, and this is what the lawmakers I talk to tell me is that they wish they could do, is if you have more conversations with people who disagree with you, you end up not only understanding the world better, but you end up being more influential, right? I'm guessing that for everyone in this room, you've got someone at work who who you wouldn't have a beer with. Right? They're not necessarily someone who's your best friend. You don't necessarily look forward to the meeting that you're going to have where they're in the meeting. And yet, when you have that meeting, you make sure they're in the room because they're the ones who are bringing up the new ideas. They're the ones who are challenging how you see the world. They're the ones who are asking if the story inside your head is the story that works best. We understand at work how important it is to surround ourselves with people who might see things differently. Yeah. But it turns out it's just as important in life, right? Like the best communities are the ones that don't all agree with each other. It's the ones where people disagree in interesting ways and they can hear each other. And so I'm hoping that, and politicians want it. I talk to politicians all the time. Yeah. They want this better world to emerge, and hopefully we're going to move towards that.
I got an idea and a question. We need to start seeing a conversational version of Crossfire, the old show on CNN. Instead of a debate, why not put them around a table and film them just having conversation?
Yeah.
You can't debate, but you just gotta ask questions. The format would be you have to ask some questions to understand.
Yes.
That would be fascinating.
Well, and as you say that, I actually think about the podcast that we mentioned before. Like, if you think about the Joe Rogan show, Rogan talks to a lot of people that he doesn't agree with, right? But he never says, you're a moron, right? he asks these questions, and some of the people who come on the show say crazy things.
Oh, yeah.
But he asks some questions. He does exactly what I think you're just describing, and I think that's why people like it. I think that's why people like your show, is because they know I'm going to tune in, and I'm not going to hear two people just shouting at each other. I'm going to hear two people trying to understand each other.
Yeah.
That's what makes a show powerful.
Yeah. For our wide audience here, different positions in their professional life, who are some people that stand out to you? It doesn't have to be politicians. Any sector, right now, you go, these are truly super communicators.
So it's hard to answer because we see them talking in public, but we don't see them face to face. But I'll tell you,
That's fair. So what you're saying is, I don't know if I can hold them to the standard that I write about in the book.
But I think about Satya Nadella at Microsoft.
Okay.
So Microsoft was this company that was basically falling apart, right? People were at each other's throats. They were sort of living on this legacy business. Satya Nadella comes in as the new CEO, and he basically gets everyone to change their culture and their attitude. And when I've talked to people about why, one of the things that they say is, it's because he would talk about himself in these really vulnerable ways. He has a son, a child who was born with disabilities and actually passed away a few years ago. And Satya would talk all the time about how hard it is to be a parent, that he understood how you have to balance life and home and work, and that some days you come in and you just can't be your best self because you're thinking about other stuff. And he somehow broke through this culture and convinced everyone to see each other in their life. Steve Jobs would do the exact same thing in a very, very different way, right? Steve Jobs, everyone knows that he would be a jerk sometimes, he would be a yeller. But the people who work with him that I've talked to said, that's true. But what they don't tell you about is they don't tell you that, first of all, he was as critical with himself, and you saw that vulnerability. And second of all, he would always say, look, the reason I am so frustrated with you is because I know you are capable of amazing work. And this is not the amazing work you do. Right? There isn't one kind of communication that works. There is wanting to communicate. And when we say wanting to communicate, that means not just saying, I've got an idea in my head, and you better do what it is, and you should think I'm smart, and I'm right, and you're wrong. But wanting to hear from you what you're experiencing, so that you can hear from me what I'm experiencing, and so that we can come together.
Yeah, that's really good. I want to get into some specific sides of things. I want to think about salespeople.
Okay.
All right, so you think of these three kinds of conversations, and as we were talking earlier, you said we kind of move a bit of a roller coaster through the practical, the emotional, the social. For someone who is in a sales role, yeah, we're talking about connection. If you're going to get somebody to buy from you need to be focused on connection, not your talking points.
Yeah.
What would you say to them in those unique roles? Anybody who's got to sell, it could be a pitch, it could be an executive, but how would you take these three types of conversations and what you've learned and say, all right, practically speaking, if I was going to get on a whiteboard and get ready to go in, like they got you, Coach Charles,
Right.
5 minutes before they go into a big pitch, what can you give them today that is like, okay, I get that, and I think I can. Is that too simple of a setup?
No, not at all. In fact, there's a chapter in Super Communicators about a CIA officer.
Yeah.
And this guy wanted to be a CIA officer his whole life. He gets hired. He gets sent to Europe. And he's like the worst CIA officer on earth. He's trying to recruit overseas spies. And he'll go into embassy parties. And people will say things like, I know you're trying to recruit me to be a spy. Get away from me immediately. And so this guy had this experience where he was trying to recruit this young woman who worked in the foreign service in a Middle Eastern country. And he's trying for months, and it just, she keeps on saying, I don't even want to talk to you, I don't like you. And he convinces her to have one more dinner with him. And during this dinner, he's thinking to himself, okay, how am I going to sell it? How am I going to be a salesman? How am I going to convince her to become a spy for the CIA? And he's thinking about it, he's like, I got nothing. I've tried all the tricks in my bag, nothing has worked. And then during dinner, he actually remembers this thing that had happened before he joined the CIA. He had gone to work for his dad, selling metal joists. And he was a salesman, and he was a terrible salesman. But he went into this one meeting with this woman who was a CEO of a small company, and the kid was playing next to the desk, and she's on the phone when he gets in, and he waits till she's off the phone. He starts this pitch, and she says, "Thanks for your pitch. I really appreciate it." And then she's had a day, so she just starts unloading. She starts saying like, it's just so hard being a working mom. Like my kid's here, and it's hard to be like a boss and a mom at the same time. And she kind of talked for 3 or 4 minutes, just talking about her life. And this guy, Jim Lawler, he's like 27 years old. He has no idea what to say, right? This adult has just like told them about his life, told him about their life, and he's just totally overwhelmed. And so he just says like, yeah, that sounds really hard. My dad, he hired both me and my brother, and my brother's a much better salesman than I am. And so like every time I go over to dinner at my parents' house, it's just terrible. Like it's just like I feel awful about myself. And then she says, "It's been a nice conversation. Thanks so much." Doesn't order anything. And he walks away being like, "I'm the worst salesman on earth." And she calls 2 weeks later and she says, "Hey, I'd like to give you this order." And it's the biggest order of his career. And he says, "Why are you doing this? Like I don't feel like
I just confessed to you.
Yeah, I don't feel like I did a good job." And she said, "No, but I felt like we had a connection. I feel like we understand each other." And he's thinking about that experience as he's talking to this young woman that he's trying to recruit. And he just decides to be totally honest with her. And he says, "Look, you're about to fly home to your country, and I know you're really disappointed that you couldn't figure out things here in Europe about being a better version of yourself. And I understand that because I'm about to get fired. And all I've ever wanted to do is work for the CIA. And they're going to send me home. And I know what it's like to be disappointed. And she's listening, she starts crying and reaches across the table. He's like, "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to make you cry. I'm not trying to recruit you. I just said..." She says, No. I think I understand for the first time what you trying to tell me. I think I can help you." And she goes on to be the best recruit in the Middle East that the CIA has for 20 years.
Wow.
And the reason why he realizes is because he wasn't trying to sell her. He wasn't trying to pitch her. He was trying to be authentic with her. And when we're authentic with someone else, they become able to listen to us. So I'd say for those salesmen that are going into that pitch, the first thing you can do is before you get into your pitch, be your authentic self. And that might mean sharing something that seems a little unusual for a salesman to share. Might be talking about your family and your experiences, or why you're passionate about this product if you are.
It's got to be some level of vulnerability. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, can we be authentic outside of being vulnerable?
No. And I think most people misunderstand what vulnerability is, because we think of vulnerability as, I got to cry on your shoulder or tell you all about my mom, right? That's not vulnerability. Vulnerability is a very specific thing that happens in our brain. When I say something to you that you could judge, it makes me feel vulnerable. Now, I might not actually care about your judgment. I might tell you I like Star Trek more than Star Wars. And you think that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, because Luke Skywalker is better than Captain Kirk. Right. And I don't care. I'm just telling you it. But the act of telling you something that you could judge makes me feel vulnerable. And when, instead of judging, you respond with acceptance or with a vulnerability of your own, telling me that you like Deep Space Nine more than Star Trek, suddenly we feel closer to each other. Even though we might not agree with each other, we feel closer because we've given the person the opportunity to judge, and they haven't used that against us.
Okay, I've got to stay here because I think this is going to be huge. Okay. We have to communicate to a team. So it could be a team of 10. It could be a team of 1,000. We see this playing out in major businesses, the biggest names out there. I could just lay them out there. It's in the headlines. And they get into trouble, and I say trouble as it relates to bad media.
Right.
All right? Things aren't going well because there's this sense of fear, and they're trying to control messaging, and they're trying to guard against, because we're talking about the stock price here, we're talking about millions and billions of dollars. But I'm sitting here listening to you, and it's that authenticity from a communication as you're telling that story in one-to-one situation, but now one-to-many. How does a leader take what we've just heard there and say, okay, now I've got to speak to many. I've got to speak to my entire team. We're going to make a pivot. Maybe our stock price has been down. Our profits are off. We are in a place of turmoil, or we are in a place of the unknown. And they're casting vision. How do they take what you've just been talking about, what you've been researching, and make sure that they're truly vulnerable and authentic when that seems like the absolute most horrifying thing a leader can do?
Seems like you're walking on a tightrope, and now you're like suddenly like swaying from side to side by choice, right?
Yeah, because you just said, say something that someone could judge you on. Well, if we're talking about Star Trek and Star Wars, stakes are low.
Right.
But now the stakes are high. Take us there.
So let me start by saying the wrong way to do it. The wrong way to do it is one of two things. Either to come in when you're not confident and just project nothing but confidence, right? If you've thought a lot about this decision and you're like, look, this is the right decision because I think there's an 80% chance it's going to work, and you come in and you say, this is the only decision possible. This is fantastic. If any of you are worrying about this, don't worry at all. That everything that you're feeling, you don't got to feel it. That's not going to work, right? That's not going to be authentic, and more importantly, you're not showing people you're listening. Instead, you're trying to just bowl them over. The other thing that's really a bad idea is to show vulnerability about something you're not actually vulnerable about, right? If you get up and you tell a story about your kid, and it's not something you feel, but you really want to have a story about your kid to connect with people are going to know, right? They're going to see through that. If you say, we have to do layoffs, and I really thought about it and I cried last night about these layoffs. And if you're not really a crier, everyone's going to be like, this jerk, like he's rubbing salt in the wound.
There was a famous story, the CEO of Better.com.
Yeah.
Oddly enough, that was the name of his company. He did this at his kitchen table and faux cried. It was the worst.
It was the worst.
Was major news.
It was terrible. So those are the wrong things. What's the right thing? The right thing to do is to talk about your own journey, right? Look, everyone here knows that this company is going through a rough patch. And I'm sure many of you are worried that we might have to do layoffs. I worry about that, and I want to prevent that. And so I sat down and I went through all the possible things that we could do. Here's the plan that I think is best, and let me explain why I think it's best. And if you're worried about it, if you have objections, I want to hear them. But then I want us to disagree and to commit, because we need one plan going forward. And I'm going to be as authentic with you as I can, and I want you to be authentic with me. And part of my authenticity is to say, I believe in this plan. That doesn't mean that your worries aren't legitimate, but I believe in this plan. We have worked so hard on this plan. I think it can work if we all get behind it. And let me explain to you why. That's so much more authentic, right? And the truth of the matter is, everyone knows that when a company's going through a rough patch, it's not the fault of any one person. It's not the fault of the CEO. It's the fault of fate. It just happens. Every company has a rough patch. And it's how you behave during that rough patch that determines whether you're a real leader.
That's right. And I've had this crazy privilege of coaching 10,000 professionals over the last several years who are leading leaders. Now they're presenting as, should I leave this company? But they're ultimately leading leaders. And the reason I say that is because as I've just dug into each of the stories, it's not so much that a leader did something wrong to them. It's most of the time they didn't do something for them. And my thought process as I'm listening to you is that connection. If you connect with your team, even in the most unknown of circumstances, so here you are trying to say, this is where we are, a lot of uncertainty. I'm still leading. There's a whole lot I don't know. I think that forges a tremendous connection. I think people are willing to be in the foxhole with you a little bit longer than maybe they would have been if you got up there and you do this bravado junk or some misdirection, sleight of hand. Is that?
Yeah, no, that's
feel that's true. I think that's true.
And think about our marriages, because in many ways, our work is a little bit like marriage, right? There's no one in this room who's been married for more than 2 years who can say, it's been great every single day. Right?
Right.
There are rough patches where if I was to drop you in the middle of one of those rough patches, you'd be like, I'm calling a divorce lawyer. Like, this is not right. You don't have any context. But because we trust each other, because we know that we can work through this, we say, look, the good outweighs the bad here. I'm going to stick around. I'm going to make it happen. The same thing has to be true at your company, with your boss, with the people that you're leading. If you say, look, you come into work every day because I'm going to give you $1, and if you work really, really hard, I'm going to give you $1.25, but as soon as you stop working really, really hard, I'm going to fire you, then there is no good. There's just transactions. But if you come in every day and you say, Jim's got my back. Like, my kid was sick last week, and I couldn't make that meeting, and Jim covered for me. And he's going through something right now. This company's going through something. I want to have his back because we get each other. That's what's known as psychological safety. And psychological safety is the ability to bring your full self to work and not worry about the consequences of it. And when you can do that, not only do you do amazing things, your company does amazing things.
That's gold.
Yeah.
What you just said is absolute gold gospel. You pick your term. That's true. People need to have psychological safety to weather storms with you.
Absolutely.
And they, by the way, they will look to you for that.
Yes.
It's not the answer. It's not the next strategy. I think they're looking for, do I feel safe under this person's leadership?
And we don't test psychological safety when we're feeling really good and everything's going okay.
Correct.
Right? When
Right.
profits are rising every single day,
That's right.
nobody says like, I wonder if my boss has got my back. It's during those moments when having your back is a little bit harder that we look to take the measure of the person. And if at that moment they say, you can bring your full self to work, I want you to succeed to your best ability so that we all succeed, then even when you're going through that downturn, you say, no, this is where I'm staying.
We've been talking about a lot of positive things and how we can use these 3 types of conversations to communicate, to connect. But you also wrote a fabulous book that I had the privilege of interviewing you on years ago, The Power of Habit. And I want to know, what are some top-of-mind bad habits that are hindering our communication so that we aren't connected?
So,
Stay away from these.
yeah, stay away from these. So, and I'll give you the solutions to it. So,
Oh, good.
so there's one in marriage therapy that like is known as the pattern or the habit that a couple can fall into, which almost inevitably leads to divorce. And it's known as kitchen sink.
Okay, I got to take notes on this one. I've made it 27 years, so I want to finish
you got
well.
some good stuff going on.
Okay, kitchen sinking. All right.
So kitchen sinking is when we're having a fight, and a fight becomes one thing, suddenly, or a fight about one thing becomes a fight about everything. Right? So every couple fight.
Do you have cameras in my house? I feel very exposed right now.
Right. So we're talking about like where we're going to go on Thanksgiving.
Right.
And then it becomes, well, your mom hates me.
Right.
And we can't do that because you don't earn enough money. Right? That's the kitchen sink. You're throwing everything in.
Okay.
That is a terrible pattern. And I'm sure you don't actually do that because it really destabilizes. So what is the right habit? The right habit, well, let me explain why we're doing that. We're doing that because when we're in a fight, when we feel threatened, we have an impulse to control. And the most obvious thing to control is the other person. So I try and say to you, like, no, I'm not going to talk about that. Or you always, yeah, you're right. I did that thing wrong, but you did this thing, right? I want to control this conversation. And we hate it when someone else tries to control us.
So now the wall's still up.
And now the wall's going. So what do we do instead? What's the better habit? Well, we still have that instinct to control, but instead of me trying to control you, instead of me trying to control where this conversation goes, let's find some things we can control together. Like, what if we both say, okay, look, let's just talk about Thanksgiving. We're not going to talk about moms. We're not going to talk about money. We can talk about that later. But for right now, let's just talk about Thanksgiving. We're going to control the boundaries of the conversation together. What if we control the environment? Okay, it's 11 o'clock at night. Instead of talking about this, can we just, let's sleep and then talk about this in the morning when we're both a little bit better rested. Is that okay? Now we're controlling the environment together. If we take that impulse for control and we apply it to things that we can do together, then suddenly we're on the same page. And instead of us coming at everything at a loggerheads, now we can say, here's the thing that we're not seeing eye to eye, but we want to sit on the same side of the table and figure it out together. That's the first really important habit. Another communication habit that's really can be really bad, and a better alternative is many of us don't totally understand what listening is because we've fallen into a listening habit that we see modeled in television and movies. where listening means I stop talking and just listen. Maybe I make eye contact. Maybe I shake my head. But as you know, that's not listening. What listening is not only hearing what you're saying, but also proving to you. And there's a technique, particularly in situations of conflict, that's known as looping for understanding, that they teach at all these law schools and business schools, about how to prove that you're listening to something. And it's got 3 steps. The first step is ask a question, preferably a deep question, right? If you're curious, get curious. Just ask any question. Then listen to what the person replies. Step 2, repeat back in your own words what you heard them say. Now, the important thing here is this isn't about mimicry, right? Because if I just mimic you, that's what bad salesmen do. You know that I'm not paying attention. I'm just on autopilot. But if I say to you, you told me this thing, and it's so interesting. It reminds me of something you said last week. And what I hear you saying is this, that you're frustrated by X, Y, and Z. That's step 2. Repeat back in your words. Step 3, and this is the step I always forget, because we usually do 1 or 2 kind of intuitively. Step 3 is ask if you got it right. Did I hear you correctly? Am I understanding what you're saying? Because what's actually happening in that moment when I ask you if I heard you, if I got it right, I'm asking you for permission to acknowledge that I was listening.
Yeah.
And when you acknowledge that, you become more likely to listen to me. So the bad habit is just to say, oh, listening is about keeping my mouth shut. And the good habit is to say, no, listening is active. Listening is asking follow-up questions. Listening is looking for understanding. Listening is showing you that I'm paying attention. And that means sometimes I talk and I contribute, and we have a conversation instead of monologues.
This is back to what you said a few moments ago, that marriage and our work relationships are so similar. And again, this is huge for existing with a coworker. You got a problematic coworker. So this is team member to team member. I got some frustration here. I can see it in pocket, whatever it is. And then the leader, because what I hear there is psychological safety back to that. That person, when I do step 3, which is genius, did I hear that right? I am not making a statement. I am keeping it in that interrogative kind of, because what's great about a question, I've always said this, versus a statement, is a question requires you to have input.
Yeah.
If I make a statement, you might get defensive immediately. But what I love about that technique is, here's what I'm hearing you say, did I get that right? They feel seen and heard.
That's absolutely, yeah.
They're actually trying. My leader just looked at me and said, did I get that right? They're actually leaning in psychologically.
Yeah, absolutely. And what could be more humble, right? What could be a greater display of humility than saying, hey, am I hearing you correct? I was thinking about this. You take a lot of flights. I take a lot of flights. I'm sure many of you guys take flights all the time. So there's nothing worse than when you're there and the person in front of you just like puts their seat back suddenly into your lap, right? And it's like,
Yeah, right.
It's like 11 o'clock in the morning. Do you really need to recline in your chair? Because I can't open my computer
I just got
now.
my iPad
Yeah,
set
exactly,
up.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it used to drive me crazy. And I was talking to this researcher, and he's like, here's what you should do. When the person does it, just tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, I'm really sorry. Do you mind just moving your chair up a little bit, just because I need a little bit more room? And I totally understand, like, you want to recline. And is that okay? And he said, 2 things will happen. Number 1, they'll move their chair almost all the way up, because suddenly they have a relationship. Number 2, you'll stop caring whether the chair is back. Suddenly they're this person, because they're probably going to turn to you and they're going to be like, oh, I'm sorry, I hurt my back and I really have to like lean back, but I'll try and raise it up a little bit. And suddenly you're like, oh, the guy's got a hurt back. Like, I guess I can, it bothers you less. So I think, to exactly your point, when we just try and say, you're not the rude dude putting your chair back, you're a human being, and break through that, suddenly not only are they more willing to accommodate us, we become more willing to accommodate them. The thing they're doing bothers us less.
That's key, by the way, to getting along with coworkers.
Yeah.
I mean, I see this data all the time because I'm studying it, but it's bananas like how many people will leave a job that is a great professional spot for them, but they just cannot get past dealing with a difficult person.
Yeah. And oftentimes, if some leader came into their life and said, there seems like there's some tension here, let's sit down, let's talk about that tension, let's talk about who we are.
That's really good. I love that. We were talking about this earlier. I want to come back to it because part of this, that's Jimmy, is the polarization in America.
Yeah.
And so you walk into a situation and you got somebody who's real comfortable talking about what they think and how they vote and all that kind of stuff, and it may just get on your last nerve. Let's talk about putting up a boundary as an extension of where we just were. So in other words, you might go, all right, I can understand them, but I also can say, that's not a conversation that I want to have, and it may not be best for me to have.
Right.
How do we communicate a boundary without making it awkward and weird?
Yeah. This is a really good question because people worry about awkwardness like this all the time.
Oh, we're all terrified of offending people.
And they're so worried about it that they actually prevent themselves from having a conversation because they're worried that the awkwardness will come up, or they're worried about how the conversation is going to end. So the best thing we can do is to just, again, sort of share something that's authentic about yourself and say, you seem really passionate about politics. I'm feeling like my person lost, and I'm mourning that. And if you don't mind, I just want to, maybe we can talk about sports instead, depending on who you're rooting for.
Yeah,
because this is such a hard topic for me. I'm still working through it. Is that okay? Right. So two things has happened there. Number one, instead of telling you you're a jerk, you're wrong, you're bringing up stuff, I disagree with you. You know that I disagree with you. But I'm saying I'm just going to tell you about my experience. I'm going to say something about what I'm feeling, not a comment about you. And number two, I'm going to ask you for permission. Is it okay if we talk about sports instead? Just because this is weighing on my soul right now, and I'm trying to deal with it. When I ask you for permission, suddenly you say, "Oh yeah, sure, that's fine. I got no problem with that."
It's the airplane seat again, isn't it?
It's the airplane seat. Exactly. Like when I break through and I say, "Hey, look, do you mind if we talk about something else?" Now, very often the awkwardness that people worry about is the opposite direction. My dad passed away. We're actually coming up on his birthday. And when I went home for the funeral, I came back to work afterwards, and people were like, where were you last week? And I said, oh, my dad passed away. I was at his funeral. And everyone would say basically some version of, oh, my condolences, I'm so sorry. And then they would move on to other stuff. Because they didn't know what to say. They were worried about saying the wrong thing. They were worried about it being awkward. But I had just been thinking for the last week all about my dad. This is the biggest thing in my life. If someone had said, what was your dad like? Tell me about him. I would have loved that. Right? It would have felt like such a gift for someone to say, tell me about the eulogies. What did people say about him? What was amazing? So oftentimes we avoid the conversation not only because we're worried about something we don't want to talk about, we avoid the conversation because we are worried that we will talk about something and we don't know how to handle it. And the answer is, the best thing we can do is to ask that deep question. Say, what was your dad like? And if they don't want to tell you what their dad was like, they'll be like, oh, he was wonderful. He was a wonderful guy.
Is it because we're afraid of being rejected on some level? Or what is that fear there might be a couple fears that's at the root of asking that question.
Yeah.
I mean, you shared, okay, well, we're worried about, but what's another level below that, why we're so reticent to do
So
that?
researchers have looked at this a lot, and what's happening is basically a misforecast of what's going to happen. So I give a lot of speeches where I talk about communication. And what I do in the speech is, and this is modeled after some work that was done by a professor at the University of Chicago, is I say, in 30 minutes, I'm going to ask you to turn to the person next to you and ask and answer one question. And that question is, when is the last time you cried in front of another person? And then I ask, who's excited about this? And no hands go up, right? Nobody wants to do this.
Yeah.
They're at a conference. They're at a trade show.
Yes.
And here I am telling them they're going to have a therapy session with the person next to them.
Right.
They think it's a terrible idea. But then I explain about deep questions and about looking for understanding and how communication works and the three types of conversations. And what I say is, all of you think that conversation is going to go terribly. So So let's go ahead and try it. Let's do it. We do the experiment, right? People talk 2 minutes per person. And then I ask them, raise your hand if that conversation went better than you thought it would. And every single hand in the room goes up. It was a great conversation. People sometimes say it was the best conversation they've had in the last week. People will hug each other. Sometimes people will start tearing up. There's a lot of laughter because they're telling funny stories. So what's happening there is that people are trying to forecast how awkward is this conversation going to be, and they're getting the forecast consistently wrong. And many of us do, right? Because we don't practice. When someone says that they were at a funeral, we don't ask, tell me about that person, what were they like? And the first time we do it, we realize, oh, my forecast of how that conversation was going to go was totally off. It went a lot better than I thought it was going to. Yeah. I'm sure everyone in this room, everyone listening, they've had that experience where they were like up in knots about a conversation, and they had it, and afterwards they're like, oh, that went so much better than I thought it was going to. The lesson to learn there is we often misforecast how awkward it's going to be, how painful it's going to be, how bad it's going to be if we say the wrong thing. And if we learn that that's a misforecast, it stops us from preventing ourselves from doing the right thing.
Wow. And it's a muscle, just like being else.
Exactly.
You gotta wade in and ask a question.
Exactly. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So what's the toughest conversation you've had in your life?
With my oldest son.
Yeah.
And he just needed to air some grievances. And he was going to college. I've since learned, of course, I consider myself an amateur psychologist in the work that I do. And so I learned from different sources that all kids that go from high school to college, whether it be a boy or girl, despite their situation, they essentially begin to psychologically break up with their parents. Sometimes they're friends. In other words, they got some anxiety about this new world. They know it's normal. They may be equally excited and also scared.
Yeah.
And so what they do is they know how hard it's going to be. And so they begin to put up boundaries and push away and sometimes hurt people close to them. They don't know what they're doing.
Right.
Their frontal lobe, of course, is still not developed. Yeah. I'm 50. I'm not sure mine is either. But it was a hard conversation, and we just shared a lot of stuff. And it was hard to sit there, but I also knew he needed it. Like it wasn't a mean-spirited thing. I could sense it. It was emotional. It was an emotional conversation. But it was very hard to sit there and let him get that out. It's your boy.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you asked me, that's the one. I mean, it rocked my world.
How's it been since then? Did that conversation...
Oh, it's been a healing process.
Yeah.
It's funny how when they go away, this will encourage you. When they go away, they realize how good it actually is. You know what I mean?
Yeah. When I was young, I thought my dad was real dumb, but he got smarter as I got older. It really...
It's funny, you probably heard this, but Mark Twain famously said, he used to talk about the 18-year-old who went off and came back 4 years later, and he couldn't believe how much his dad had learned in that time. I mean, that's classic Mark Twain.
Totally works.
But that's great. Okay, let's go to a question here.
So I'm just curious your thoughts on an employee that has a leader or leaders that are overly practical all of the time, not emotional, and really can't meet them where they are. And it's a critical environment, a lot. But the employee loves the organization. They want to stay there. They don't want to leave. But how can they have that conversation with their leader to help them understand what they need, the validation, and to be seen and safe? Yeah. I'm just really curious how you would recommend employees
to have that conversation. It is a great question. It's a really good question. And I'll mention, before answering it, we don't have to have every conversation. Right? Nobody should ever have to have a conversation that we don't want to have. And sometimes we get into the taxi or the Uber, and we don't want to talk to the driver. We want to check our email, and that's totally okay. And sometimes you get on the plane, and you just want to watch your show. But you're right. There are times when we need or want to talk to someone, and we're having trouble breaking through because they're so unpracticed in the emotional conversation. Or sometimes they're really emotional, and they're really unpracticed at the practical conversation. Or sometimes they don't want to get social with us. We keep on asking, like, what'd you do this weekend? And they say, nothing, is a good weekend, right? They don't want to break through. So what do we do in those moments? In those moments, oftentimes, if we adopt the habit of the language that they're comfortable with, we can introduce what matters to us. So in that situation where I need you to understand that there's some emotional stuff going on, and I need you to be someone who can hear that. I think what I would do is I'd write an email and I would say, I want to bring something up. I'm feeling this way, and let me explain to you why feeling this way is important for us to talk about. It's going to impact you. It's impacting my team. It's impacting how I'm able to get work done. It's going to impact our profits, right? I'm using the language of practicality to say to you, there is a practical reason why you should hear what I'm saying. And I guarantee you, if you do that, the person reading that note is going to say, oh, I actually can have an emotional conversation. I feel the same thing, right? I don't know how to express it very well. I'm not very practiced at it, but I understand what's going on there. The language that we use is different from the conversation we're having. We can have an emotional conversation that sounds like practical conversation. Men do this all the time, right? They come and they say, I'm worried about about the budget. Let's talk about the numbers. What they're really saying is, I'm really worried that we're not going to be able to make the mortgage. Like, let's talk about that anxiety and figure out how to deal with it. Figuring out what kind of conversation we want to have, and then figuring out what kind of language people are comfortable having that conversation in, that helps us bridge that divide. Because if you're a practical person and you're totally inexperienced in having emotional conversations, and I come in and I say, I'm so stressed and I just want to tell you about what I'm feeling, you're not going to know how to deal with it. But if I send you an email and I say, here's the 3 reasons why I'm feeling stressed right now and why they're going to impact our productivity and our profitability and why I need your help, suddenly they're going to say, oh, I know how to interact with this. This feels normal.
It feels like it would be so important, Charles, for every manager to sit with their team at some point and make it fun and go, okay, here's these 3 types of conversations. Which one of these do you most feel comfortable? So that we kind of, so if I'm leading a team of 10, I at least go, okay, well, Charles, he really loves social way more than practical. But see, Linda over here, like, the more practical, the more energy she has. And then, boy, this one, they love the emotion. They can't even get to practical unless we start emotional. Would that be a great exercise?
It would be a great exercise. It would be a fantastic exercise, because what you're going to find is the person who really likes that social conversation keeps on bringing up like what they did that weekend, and you're like, let's just get down to work. Like, why do you keep bringing up all this social stuff? What you're going to learn is they say, I feel like if I can connect with you, like we work together better. And so now when they bring up this social thing, what'd you do this weekend? It's a 15 or 20-second conversation, but instead of brushing you off, I say, oh, Jimmy needs a social conversation. Like, he told me he needs a social conversation. So I say, oh, I'm going to the mall this weekend. I'm taking my kids to the dentist. And then 20 seconds later, we're on to the agenda.
Yeah.
We all have conversations that we feel more or less comfortable with. And oftentimes when other people, exactly as you pointed out, when other people ask us what kind of conversation we want to have, even in the moment, it makes us feel like we can communicate better. Now when I come home and I complain about my day, my wife turns to me and she says, do you want me to help you solve this? Or do you just need to get this off just vent and get this off your chest, right? Do you want to have a practical conversation or an emotional conversation? And it feels wonderful when she asks me that. And I say, like, no, we don't have to solve it. I just didn't want to get off my chest.
I can't wait to freak my wife out. She's going to go, who are you? I mean, if I come at her, I go, which one of these do you need to have? But I think it's so easy and it's very memorable. And I selfishly should point out, who's back there behind the curtain, I don't like meetings. And so when I go from meeting to meeting, and I like, bless his heart, he's very practical, but I like a little social in the meeting. Yeah. Sometimes in the middle of a meeting. Because I have ADHD, and something is said, and I start thinking about a show I saw, and I like to mess around for about 2 or 3 seconds.
And you telling me that?
30 to 40 seconds is probably more like it.
You telling me that? If we were in a meeting together, and suddenly you start talking about some show, instead of me being like, he's just trying to derail the meeting. Like, what is up with this guy? I'm saying, it's his ADHD. He needs
real
this.
time.
He needs this
Squirrel.
real set.
I mean, that's what's happening in real time.
I'll mention another technique that I kind of love. And let me ask, did I answer your question? Okay, thank you. So there's this other technique that I kind of love that they teach teachers to do with kids now, which is when a student comes up to you and they have like something they want to talk about, start the conversation by saying, okay, so during our talk, do you want to be helped? Do you want to be hugged? Or do you want to be heard? Wow. Which is the practical, the emotional, and the social. And the thing is, anyone who has kids at home, try this with them. What you'll find is they can tell you immediately what they want. They'll say something like, no, I don't need a hug. I just need you to know that Jimmy was being mean to me, but I need you to hear me. Or I don't need to tell you all about Jimmy, but I want to solve this problem. I need your help with it. We know what we want. And when we ask someone, do you want a practical, emotional, or social? Do you want to be helped, hugged, or heard? The other person can tell us right away. Now, in a workplace, you can't ask, do you want to be hugged, right? They're going to call HR.
Right. Yeah, all of a sudden you're a creeper.
Yes, exactly. But what you can do is you can ask that deep question. It seems to be bothered. Tell me what's important about this. What do you make of this? How do you make sense of this? In the book, we tell a story about this doctor, Dr. Vifara died, prostate surgery, removes tumors from prostate. And he found his patients kept on ignoring his advice about removing or not removing a tumorous cancer, or a cancerous tumor. And so he started his interview by asking them a question. Tell me what this cancer diagnosis means. When he did that, they oftentimes wouldn't talk about cancer. They would talk about their parents, they would talk about bankruptcy, they would talk about memories that they have. Just asking that question let him know what kind of conversation they wanted to have, and then they would hear everything he has to say.
Well, I started the show, as I do every time, saying, hey, this is a conversation designed for you to be able to get better, to move up, and to lead well. And I'm hoping you're taking away so much. I've got so many notes here. My one takeaway, something that I've learned today and I'm going to work on intentionally in the days ahead, is the deep question. And oddly enough, I do this for a living, but the idea of constantly, when I'm interacting with people, no matter what social role that is, I am asking that deeper question. What layers can I go deeper? 2, 3 layers to really make sure that I'm seeing and hearing the people that I'm communicating with. If I can do that, I've got a better opportunity to actually understand them and then actually serve them in whatever role that we are having relationally. So I challenge you to do the same. Practice it each day over the next week and see what happens. Hey, if you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to join us in studio in the future for a live recording, check out the link in our show notes for up-to-date info on guests, dates, and opportunities. Well, this was fun. I got a lot from this. I'm better for it. I know you all, my friends, are. Let's thank Charles Duhigg one more time for being with us.
Thank you so much.